Welcome to History File, the Cold War. This unit, for students in the 14 to 16 age group, provides the conclusion of a 10-part series exploring the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Dramatic reconstructions, archive footage and documentary evidence focus on the Cold War from 1945 to the late 1980s, emphasizing the Soviet perspective.
April 1945. American and Soviet troops meet in Germany. Conquerors from the west and from the east, now face to face in the very heart of Europe. Brought together with a common purpose, the defeat of Nazism, they celebrated their joint victory, toasting an end to war, toasting cooperation now between East and West. As one Soviet major put it,
with the blood of their soldiers, the Western nations had won our friendship. We felt that the war had somehow swept aside our political differences. We felt joined now by a bond forged in fire.
but within a matter of just months, cooperation turned to mistrust. A new war, a Cold War, began between the Soviets and their wartime allies. A war which would divide the world for the next 40 years. Reconstructed from the memoirs of a Soviet major, Grigory Klimov, this program explores how that Cold War began. In May '45, fresh from the victory parades in Moscow, Klimov had returned to Berlin, where he'd fought with the Red Army in the war's last few climactic weeks. His job now was to join the occupying forces in Germany's once proud capital.
Beneath me, as far as the eye could see, it was like a cemetery of ruins. In the fighting, I'd not been aware of the scale of the destruction. But from the air, Berlin was like some dead city. I felt no pity for the Germans. I reminded myself of what they'd done to us. How Russian farmers would for many years find the bones of Soviet soldiers in their fields. But equally, I wondered what good we could do here. What purpose we could have here amongst our former enemies. I was driven through the streets. Survivors of Nazi concentration camps shuffling about aimlessly. But also ordinary Germans, hungry, homeless, bewildered by the collapse of the Nazi order. As instructed, I proceeded to our headquarters in the eastern suburbs of the city.
Klimov paints a vivid picture of his time with the Soviet army in Berlin. Their function had been agreed at Yalta: to work alongside the Western Allies, rooting out Nazism, helping ensure that never again would Germany threaten the peace of Europe. It was a job in which they took no small satisfaction.
Target practice, eh, comrades?
Certainly, comrades.
We got it!
Several of them at headquarters I already knew.
Good to see you.
I was with Bagdasarian in the push for Berlin. He'd lost his eye retrieving the body of a fallen comrade. The corpse was booby-trapped.
Not before time.
Valia Grinchuk I'd met in Moscow. The Nazis had butchered her family. She joined the partisans, learned how to kill. It was, you can imagine, not easy just turning off that hatred. Where's all this stuff from?
Good, isn't it? Liberated this morning from the house of Herr Bernhardt on Liebestrasse.
Was he a Nazi?
In a spirit of true communism, we decided to treat them all equally.
Don't be so disapproving, Grigori.
To the victor, the spoils. That's what it comes down to.
Officially, the Soviet Union had asked for $10 billion in reparations from Germany. Goods in kind to repay some of the damage they'd suffered. German factories were transported back to the Soviet Union, brick by brick, machine by machine. The Allies, the Americans and British, did not disapprove. Few underestimated the scale of the Soviet sacrifice. 25 million Soviet citizens dead, 1,700 towns, 70,000 villages destroyed. The Red Army had borne the brunt of the fighting, and Uncle Joe Stalin, the Soviet leader, was as much admired in the West as he was by most in the East. But already, those with longer memories wondered what Stalin's plans were now the war was over. Because Stalin was not just a revered war leader, he was a dictator, a tyrant. In the 1930s, he'd killed as many Russians as had died fighting Hitler. For Klimov and others like him in the Soviet military, the future was viewed with hope, but also anxiety.
You see, for many of us before the war, we had hated our country, what the communists had done to it. The war changed everything. It gave us a reason to love Russia, to feel proud. The day the war ended, I was in Moscow. I was with Valia. We were swept up together in the crowd, in all that joy. And I remember thinking that this was our victory, not Stalin's. And I remember praying that in this new dawn, we could be something better now. That he would let us be something better than we had been before. I hoped that in Berlin I would see this dream put into practice.
Germany had been divided into 4 zones of occupation. Berlin, the capital, lay in the heart of the Soviet zone. It was itself subdivided, the western sectors controlled by the Americans, French, and British. But there was freedom of movement at first between the zones, and many decisions were taken jointly. For young Russians like Klimov, mixing with the Allies was a profound and significant freedom.
You must remember that in Moscow before the war, if you even spoke to a foreigner, you could be arrested. Now we were meeting with them, talking to them every day. And I found myself liking them. Valia had met an American captain. We teased her about it. But all of us, I think, felt they had much to show us about freedom, about democracy.
You know what I like? How they all smoke the same brand of cigarettes, from generals down to GIs. Have you noticed? Whereas we're officers, we smoke filters. The men smoke cheap Ukrainian cheroots. Meanwhile, Shabalin sits under his big portrait of Stalin smoking a fine Crimean cigar. This is communism?
By comparison to the Soviets, the Americans had come out of the war in good health. Victory found them relatively undamaged. Their economy more than doubled in the war years, ready to exploit new markets. And just before Truman's meeting with Stalin in Potsdam outside Berlin in July '45, he learned another reason to feel confident. The Americans had just tested the world's first atomic bomb. But what the Americans failed to appreciate was how threatening their confidence might appear to the Soviet old guard.
When I look back, of course, it was obvious from the start how our friendship with the Americans would never be encouraged. My very first day, I had reported to Stalin, our general, and the language he used, it was old-style Soviet language.
The Americans you will meet, the British, you know they're all agents of capitalist espionage. You must have no personal acquaintance with them, no private conversations. Here in Berlin, you're in the most advanced line of the post-war front.
This paranoia, this sense of threat, it was what we were used to before the war. A closed society, closed minds, keeping out the rest of the world. But that was the lesson that Stalin and his kind had learned from the war. That the West threatens us. The Americans, the British, the Nazis, it makes no difference. Here in Germany, our job was to build a barrier against that threat.
Right from the start, this was the Soviet policy in Eastern Europe. As the Red Army had swept west into Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Stalin had seen emerging a belt of territory under Soviet control, securing Mother Russia against any future threat. To those liberated from Nazi rule, the Allies promised democracy. But for Stalin, democracy meant only the freedom to choose a future in line with the needs of the Soviet Union. As a result, in the four-power melting pot of Berlin, contact between Americans and Soviets became steadily more difficult.
We still attended the control commissions, but it was awkward. When a problem emerged, it was always the Americans who came up with solutions. They could take the initiative. We could only act on instructions from Moscow. We were cold and distant always. And you could see for the Westerners how frustrating this was. Meanwhile, freedom of movement between the zones was becoming increasingly difficult. And all the time, officers of the MVD, our state security police, were investigating what we at headquarters said and did. It was clear the old methods were returning.
I was in there for 5 hours. Every detail they wanted to know, they're disgusting.
And you must end the relationship.
No, that's what makes it so sick. They say relationships with Americans in some circumstances are to be encouraged. They want a compromise in Gregory. And if I don't agree to be used as bait, they'll have me arrested and shipped back to Moscow.
Klimov himself had never joined the Communist Party, though it might have helped his career had he done so. He knew now this decision put him under threat. And then, one day, he received notice that a major in the MVD was waiting for him outside.
I presumed it would mean, at the very least, my recall from Berlin. And questions as to why I'd not joined the party, a formal request that I do so, or just simply arrest, there and then. I remember feeling this emptiness in my stomach. But then, sitting there in this American car was Andre.
Hello, Grigory. Get in, then.
I didn't know I had a friend in the MVD. But it seems I did. Andre, my old friend from school and college. I thought he died in the war. He looked terrible.
Though he risked his neck in doing so, and Klimov's too, Andrei had come to unburden himself on his old friend, to share with Klimov the harsh realities of Soviet policy in Germany. Much Klimov already knew, but to have it spelled out in such detail was the final blow to Klimov's post-war dreams.
Do you know what it means, the democratization of Germany? All the bakers and sausage makers are to be sent to Siberia. The property owners are to be liquidated as a class. Do you know how we purged Berlin after the fighting stopped? It took just one night. 30,000 people taken from their beds and sent straight to the gulags. Even before our troops crossed the Oder, we had the lists prepared. During the war, I killed, I don't know how many Germans. I was on special duties. We didn't take prisoners. But you know what we're doing now? We're killing the German soul.
The Soviets, in their zone of Germany, were using the same techniques they were to use in all the Eastern European countries they controlled. At first, apparent democracy. Elections were held. But when the communists failed to win enough of the vote, more underhand methods began. The merging of the German Communist Party with the parties of social democracy, then the purging of Democrats from within. There was ballot rigging, intimidation, and most dehumanizing of all, the deterioration even further of German standards of living, encouraging the Germans in the Eastern Zone to think of communism as their only hope. Despite the terrible winter of 46-47 and the famine that followed, there was no relaxation of the hard Soviet policy of forced reparations.
It became desperate, the black market thriving. You saw Germans selling umbrellas, shoes, old clothes. And meanwhile, in the streets, German communists were marching, herded like sheep by their Soviet masters.
Oldest trick in the book. Drag them down far enough, then offer them cake to win them over. When Germany surrendered, I took it for granted we'd take what we could from Europe. We were the victors. But that then, we'd set our house in order. Instead, back home, Stalin drains every last drop of our blood. And now we find ourselves forcing our muck down these people's throats too. Building a new proletariat in Europe. Is that what we fought for?
The problem of Germany brought into focus divisions in the wartime alliance. The Western Allies looked to the east and saw no longer an army of liberation, but a conquering army digging in. And in their own zones, the ruins a breeding ground for communism, they saw how Soviet influence could spread still further. And so, by necessity, their attitudes towards the Germans, their old enemies, began to soften. In the British zone, rather than dismantling factories, industry was encouraged once again to get the German economy rolling. The American Secretary of State, General Marshall, organized massive loans for Western Europe, the Marshall Plan, out of humanity, but as much to block the spread of communism. Meanwhile, the western zones of Germany were merged, and in 1948 they became an independent country, with its own constitution and currency, with West Berlin supplied by road and rail through Soviet-controlled territory. Freedom in West Germany had been secured through America's economic muscle. But the price was the acceptance of Soviet control in the East.
We were left with only the memory of the time when Russians had been welcomed as liberators and allies. All the sympathy Russian soldiers had won in the world, gone. We'd wanted a breathing space after the war. But already we could see new storm clouds gathering, and our hearts sank. We thought back to the way we judged the Germans in 1945. All the same, all guilty. Well, what about us then, wearing this uniform? Would we one day all be judged guilty too?
In 1948, Stalin closed the supply lines between West Germany and West Berlin to force the Allies to abandon this pocket of freedom within his sphere of influence. In this, the first test of the Cold War, the Americans showed their resolve, organizing an airlift on an astonishing scale, 450 flights every day to keep West Berlin from collapse. The message was clear. The battle lines were now drawn. There would be no retreat. And Stalin was finally shown to the world in his true colors. No longer Uncle Joe, but a man capable of planning the slow starvation of a city of 2 million people. But that was a lesson Klimov had learnt long before. He'd already made his choice. One morning, in early 47, he'd taken off the uniform which caused him such shame. He'd burnt his papers, and dressed in unfamiliar civilian clothes, he'd disappeared into the streets of Berlin to seek amnesty in the Western Zone.